As the lector mentioned in the announcements at the beginning of Mass, today is the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time. There are 34 Sundays in Ordinary Time. It's almost done. And then we have Advent, and then Christmas, and shortly after Lent, and then the Easter season. And so the other 6 months, 5 months approximately, are devoted to the mysteries of the Lord. And this ordinary time is, especially in St. Luke, devoted through the Gospels to the instruction, to the education, if you will, of the apostles. The last time I was with you, last April, I think it was still Easter time, and ever since then, up until today, I've gone to Mass every Sunday. Promise. And almost every Sunday, I've preached, especially in the parish of Plymouth, Ashland, and Bristol. And on the 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time, 15 Sundays ago, just before the 4th of July, in the 9th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, we heard this phrase at the opening of the Gospel: Jesus firmly resolved to proceed toward Jerusalem. What does that mean? It means the suffering, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And he said to the apostles, I'm going to summarize 15 weeks, by the way. You ready for this? No note-taking. Because Jesus, when he gave instructions to his disciples, he had to do it quick. There was no online courses. There was no textbook. They couldn't take notes. They were probably illiterate, most of them. So they had to put it in their minds, and more importantly, put it in their hearts. So he said to them 15 weeks ago, follow me. And if the apostles followed Jesus, if they were instructed, it's good for us, because we want to be his disciples. So we can listen to the same instructions that the apostles heard 2,000 years ago. Follow me. And the following week, around the 4th of July, he said, warning them, I'm sending you as lambs among wolves. It's a big, bad world out there, and they're not ready for your message, so be prepared. The following week, he mentioned the Good Samaritan, and he says the Good Samaritan really is Jesus. He finds us by the wayside. He picks us up. He binds our wounds. He heals us, and he takes us to the inn, to the church, that they can take care of us until he comes back. The following week, while in the home of Martha and Mary and Lazarus, he said to Martha, Martha, Mary is doing just fine, because it's more important for you to listen to me than to prepare a menu and wait on me and wash the pots and pans. Just listen once in a while. And the following week, he told his disciples, as you're going, whatever you're doing, you have to pray, Our Father who art in heaven, and so on and so forth. The following week, he told his disciples, you have to get rich, but in the things of heaven, not the things of earth. The things of earth you can't bring with you. And then the following week, he reminds them again, where your treasure lies, there your heart will be. In other words, if your treasure is in Wall Street or in Walmart, that's where your heart is. But if your treasure is in loving God and thanking him and serving one another, that's where your heart is. He reminds the disciples, kind of with a certain amount of warning, that this is not a happy message for everybody. In fact, in some households, there will be division. And you remember the gospel a few weeks ago of mother against daughter-in-law and so on and so forth. And the following week, he says to the disciples, kind of repetition of what he said a couple weeks before, go through the narrow door. The narrow door meaning you can't have your elbows out too far. You can't be carrying totes. Keep your elbows in. the narrow way, the way of that means you're just bringing yourself. And then he reminded them at the banquet parable, whenever you go to a banquet, take the lowest seat. In other words, he's telling his disciples, be humble. That's a byword, by the way, as you well know, if you're paying attention to Pope Francis. Humility. Do I have time? Sure, I got time. I had a beautiful lesson in humility yesterday afternoon, not for myself, but it was presented to me by your parishioners, some parishioners who stopped me after Mass, an elderly woman standing right there by the third grade St. Elizabeth Seton pew. And she says, Father, bent over in her cane, my husband and I have been married 65 years ago today. Will you give us a blessing? And she was like a teenager. And I looked around and I said, where's your husband? She said, well, he's getting me a bulletin. So he went to get a bulletin and he came back. She said, would you give us a blessing? I said, I sure will. But before, I want to know your names. And I looked at him, he says, I'm Paul. And she looked up at me, she says, he's St. Paul. And he looked at me, proud, he said, yes, I am. And this is St. Teresa. That's a sermon. They knew each other. They recognized they had given each other a hard time over these decades. They recognized they had to swallow a lot of stuff. They recognized that they were not easy to put up with all the time. They recognized that they put up with each other. They were honest. They were humble. So the following week, so they're pretty good disciples, those two. The following week, Jesus says, plan ahead. And he gave us the story of the man building a tower who didn't plan ahead. And the following week was a beautiful story of the prodigal son. And the lesson I got from that is, don't worry. The Father's always looking over you. So when you go out to preach the good news, and if you're preaching to sinners or to saints, the Father is always following you. And the following week, he said, be clever, be smart, be ingenious, use your brain like the dishonest steward. Remember? Who changed the books, and the master rewarded him. Be cunning, Jesus says. And then the following week, a couple weeks ago, Jesus said in so many words with the parable of Abraham and Lazarus, we're all going to the other side. Each and every one of us is going to go to the bosom of Abraham, and what we do here will make a difference there. And then last week, in kind of an echo of that humility lesson that he gave, last week he said, remember with the mustard seed? What I want you to do, he says, is remember who God is and who you are, like my couple yesterday. Remember who God is and who you are and what your relationship is, and that only takes faith the size of a mustard seed. That's humility. And that's what it means. And today, 15 Sundays after we heard that phrase, Jesus firmly resolved to proceed toward Jerusalem, he says in the opening phrase of this morning's gospel, as Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem. In other words, 15 weeks later, he's still focused. He's still on target. The mission is still there for him. And the disciples are still following. And they've gone to school for all these weeks. And what does he tell them today? Nothing. There doesn't seem to be any instruction. And I asked myself, wait a minute now, you can't stop teaching. So Jesus is teaching by his actions. So he meets the 10 lepers. He tells them to go show themselves to the priest, which was a prescription of the Jewish law, because there were no doctors or infectious disease nurses then. And as they went, they were healed. All of them. All 10 lepers no longer had leprosy. Like Naaman in the first reading, they were cleansed like baby skin. And yet only one of them came back and said, "Thank you to the Lord." Maybe the others were thankful, we don't know. But only one came back and said, "Thank you to Jesus." And I think what Jesus is teaching them is, even though everybody is healed, only about 10% are thankful. That's not too big. So in other words, to the disciples, to the apostles, don't get discouraged. Do your work. Reach out to a lot of people. And if only 10% come back and acknowledge it or thank you, not to worry, you still did your work. And he gave them that very valuable lesson. And so it says to me, and I hope it says to you, that, we should not be scandalized by the small number of people that come to church. In the Northeast United States, they say it's the least percentage. And as you go southwest, it gets higher. Not that it's that great down there, but up here in the Northeast, it's about 20% of people who go to church. That used to scandalize me. I used to think I didn't do my work as a priest. I used to think maybe I'd failed. And then you read this gospel and you realize 20%? That's 2 times better than Jesus did. He only got 10%. And so I'm not scandalized. It doesn't deter me in my work. I don't feel I'm alone, but I have to continue to give the example. And so you are here. And in a few minutes, as is a custom in the United States, at the Eucharistic prayer, we kneel. And before you come to communion, you bow or make some reverence. And when you do that, you are doing exactly what the Samaritan leper did. You are returning, you're glorifying God, and you fall at the feet of Jesus and thank him. That's what it means to bow or to kneel. And we realize that we're being thankful. Those of you who come to Mass on Thanksgiving Day, you'll probably hear this gospel again. Remember. And then, I hope that when you say Amen, when the Eucharistic minister or the priest says the body of Christ or the blood of Christ, I hope when you raise from your bow, I hope when you stand up from your pew, from kneeling at the great elevation, you will hear Jesus say to you, "Stand up, go. Your faith has saved you." In other words, everybody is healed. But you who are thankful are saved. That raises a little question mark, but that'll have to be when I come back next year, I guess. Pope Benedict XVI, who was a very private person, and Pope Francis, who's a very public person, have said something similar to this morning's gospel. We haven't heard it much from Pope Benedict because he is so private, but I looked into his writings and I've seen it. And Pope Francis, the Italians call him the chatterbox because he's always talking. He's easier to listen to in that sense. He said the same thing. He said yes, and Benedict said yes, just maybe, unfortunately, we have to accept the fact that there are fewer numbers in the church. Because God has his ways, and he's done it before. And maybe he's doing it again. And how unfathomable are his ways. We cannot understand them. And yet, the remnant that was left over during the exile, and this remnant that is 20% of the worshipers, believe and come together and collectively and individually fall at the feet of the Lord and say, Lord, thank you so much. And he says, stand up and go, your faith has saved you. Stand up.